Hi there. So we're going to continue our investigation of the relationship with the inner critic. And in this third video in the series, we are going to focus in on the breath. But before we do that, I'd like to just briefly review what we went over in the first two videos and talk a little bit more about the basic approach that I'm inviting you into here. So the first video was about kindness. And the inner critic is unkind. We're speaking very generally, right? But what we'd like to do is cultivate kindness with ourselves. And this flows into all kinds of aspects of our experience, including how we are with others, and maybe we've experienced unkindness coming towards us. We talked about this phenomenon known as introjection, where ideas from the outside are taken in. And we can think of the inner critic as an entity or a character that is created out of introjection. But for convenience, we do think of it as an actual character that we're in relationship with, at the same time that really we're just relating to ourselves. So in that video on kindness, I talked about three aspects of kindness, or maybe three steps towards enacting kindness, which very quickly were to pay attention, in this case, paying attention to ourselves, to our experience, the opposite of ignoring, which is what we can do both to another person, but we can really not pay attention, let's say, to our body or to our emotions or unfolding situation at the job, let's say, that isn't good for us. We can just sort of, it's happening, but we're not paying attention. So first we pay attention, and then we set an intention. Very simply, the intention is the wish for more well-being. So wanting more well-being for another person, that's part of being kind to them, and wanting more well-being for ourselves. And then the third step is to take a generous action. If you're thirsty, get a drink. It would be the very maybe most obvious example that just comes to mind. But of course, what is it that we think would actually move us from our current experience towards more well-being, given what we've just noticed is going on, right? So the second video went over the idea of presence. And this is a big subject, but basically it is the other half of what we lose in our relationship with the inner critic. When the inner critic comes along and starts talking, well, whatever is really happening in my experience right now, it gets backgrounded because this voice is telling me something, right? So another thing that we want to cultivate is this idea of being present. And having a practice around that, it is another thing that lays the basis for how we can do that. And in the video on presence, I mentioned 4 elements of experience that are always there. The first one, and the one that we're going to get into more today, is the breath, always breathing. The second is the ground. You're always on planet Earth, right? You're always supported in some way, shape, or form by a solid surface, and that relationship is crucial to your well-being. The surrounding space is always there. How are you relating to the surrounding space? And there's always sound. How is that relationship unfolding right now? Each of these categories, as I'm using that word relationship, we can think of it as a relationship. So it may be, let's say, just speaking really crude terms, it might be a good relationship or a bad relationship, but I'm part of that relationship. So if my relationship to the ground is not supporting me, I might ask what I can do to improve that relationship. Now, there's another element of experience that's always present that I'm actually going to fold into this video series. I'll just mention it now, and that is light. right? If you're watching this video and you can see it, that's because of the existence of light. And so that's just something we'll get more into as well. But I will also just say that light, it relates to what we can see and what we cannot see. And we are often orienting based on what we can see and maybe ideas about what we cannot see. So all of these things are there in our experience at all times. So if we begin to bring together the idea of kindness and the idea of presence, if I go back to that idea that I'm going to pause, pay attention to my experience, what's happening, have the intention for more well-being, and then take a generous action that moves me towards that well-being. Well, one of those actions could be to improve one of these ongoing relationships, right? So, and ideally, we just get to a place where we're so clear on our breath, our relationship to the ground, space, sound, light, or even how am I with this particular person who's in my company? And we're always paying attention, and we're always wanting what's best. We're wanting more well-being, and we're constantly making adjustments, doing things to move us towards that well-being. Now, of course, that's ideal, and we all get flustered. We all find that we aren't present in different situations. But the more tools we have along these different lines, these different relationships that I've been referring to, then we have resources to do that. Now, I will just add that if you are watching this video because the inner critic in your life feels like a real problem, and so you'd like to know what is meant by this idea of silencing the inner critic, you might be wondering, well, there hasn't been much about that voice in my head. And that's true. I'm coming at it, you might say, from a different angle. But just to say, as we move into talking about breath today, the way that I'm breathing when I'm present, and then the way that I'm breathing when I'm not present or when I'm under attack by that voice, it's going to change. So sometimes when I am trying to get clearer on what's going on with my inner critic and that voice in the head, well, sometimes it's just catching what the voice says. But sometimes the voice is like a whisper, or sometimes the voice has a very kind of a kind tone to it. It's looking out for you, and it's just saying, hey, listen, Seth, I don't think you should, go to that event because you just won't enjoy yourself. But actually, that event might be a place where I meet new people. It might be a place, might be an opportunity for me to expand my horizons. And my inner critic is just acting as if it's in my best interest, but it's actually pointing me away from my own well-being. In that moment, maybe what I notice isn't so much the voice, but as I hear the voice, how am I breathing? I'm not breathing in the way that I kind of like to breathe. So, what is that voice really saying? And it might stop me. It might make me consider what's unfolding in that moment in a different way. So that's what we're going to do in this and the upcoming videos. We're going to actually look at breath as a relationship and how that relationship to breath can shift, and likewise with ground, space, sound, and light. And we'll get to all of those. But let's zoom in now on your relationship to the breath. So your breath is obviously vital. It's ongoing at every moment. And what's very special is that the breath always reflects the state of your well-being. So if you're just sort of going along with your day and everything's kind of normal, and then suddenly you get some surprising news, let's say it's positive, or perhaps it's not so positive, but the situation changes in a kind of a startling way, it gets your attention. There's no way that your breath doesn't also change in that moment. Obviously, your breath fluctuates with the amount of physical activity that you're involved in, but also your emotion, where you're placing your attention, and the different situations that you're in, both the physical environment and what's happening around you, and different things you're thinking about. All of these aspects can shift the breath. Given that, there's actually endless subtlety to how you can study the breath. And we won't try to go into endless subtlety here today, but just to say that the basic goal that I'm suggesting to you would be very helpful in your ongoing journey around the inner critic is to become increasingly intimate with your breath, increasingly curious about the breath. And just as the breath relates to all of these different factors, well, your overall experience, of course, is always in relationship. How do you relate to yourself? How do you relate to other people? How do you relate to the news that you read? Do you have a relationship to something that you might call the divine? Do you not have a relationship? All of those things set the context. And what we can do is begin to consider the breath in some of these different situations. Now, as I'm speaking, you're probably aware that there is this whole tradition, and it's becoming more popular, of what people call breath work. Pranayama practices, different meditative practices, practices where you breathe to different parts of the body, or you breathe in different rhythms. And I think this is wonderful that there's more and more recognition of the breath and how we can work with it. And if you already have a breathwork practice, what we're talking about might just be that you pause, you notice that the breath is not so comfortable. You maybe wonder what that's connected to. But if you have a breathwork practice already, this might be the moment where you do a little bit of that breathwork. What I'd like to add, though, however, is given that there are so many different kinds of breath work, and because there are so many different factors that impact your breath just throughout the day, if you just check in with how am I breathing, how am I breathing? Well, when you wake up, when you're at work, when you're driving in the car, it's going to be changing throughout the day. So the danger with some forms of breath work is that we get too fixed on an idea of the correct way to breathe or the correct procedure that should be employed in order to find optimal breathing. There's nothing wrong with learning some exercises, and what's cool about working with the breath is that when we're not thinking about it, we just breathe automatically, but then we can intentionally bring our attention to breath, and we can decide that we want to have a shorter inhale or a longer inhale. We can do all kinds of things like that. And whatever form we're using, what we're doing is we're interrupting the breath as it's currently moving, and we're bringing in some other intentional way of breathing that we employ for a time. And then when we stop, the breath is going to settle again, but it might settle to a new rhythm, a new way of flowing through the body. And that's essentially what all forms of breath work offer us. What I'm going to share with you in this video is a few pretty basic breathwork practices, and if you're familiar with breathwork, you may have encountered them before, but I think there's some just very simple ones that it's really worth knowing about, because when you understand them, you can utilize them very briefly to great effect. And then what I'm going to do after that is I'm going to talk through a more open-ended way that you can explore the breath. And this is to invite you into that more intimate relationship that I was referring to, where some of the details, maybe we don't know always it's exactly because, X, Y, and Z is happening that I'm breathing exactly in this manner. But we can begin to get curious if we shift little details. How does the breath respond? And we can begin to have a more conscious relationship in that sense. So I'd like to outline very quickly 3 different approaches to the breath and in relationship to what we might call energy. And just very simply, do you have the energy you want to have right now? Are you kind of awake, alert, plugged in, ready to go? Or do you feel a little bit tired, a little bit heavy like that? Or perhaps, no, there's a little too much energy. There's a sense of agitation, right? All of those ways of being will be reflected in the breath. But there is a very basic way that we can work with that. So as you breathe now, I'm just going to invite you to particularly pay attention to what happens when you breathe in. What's the feeling throughout your body? And if you pay attention at the nostrils, you might notice the air is somewhat cooler than the out breath. You also might feel as you fill your chest, there's a sense of a lifting. And there might be a sense of activation, right? Are you more awake on the inhale or are you more awake on the exhale? That might be the question to ask. And I think what you'll find is that there is an activating energy that comes with the in-breath. Now, of course, it's quickly followed by the out-breath, which has more of a letting go, right? Maybe the exhale feels a little more like going to sleep. And then there's a sinking as the air is expelled from the body, right? And so just by noticing the quality of the inhale and noticing the quality of the exhale, we can decide, I think I need a little more of that up, that enlivening inhale energy, or maybe right now I could use a little bit more of that letting go of the exhale. So let's just say that you're feeling a little tired right now. The simplest thing to do is what I already asked you to do, is just with your attention, just be really mindful of the inhalation. And it doesn't mean that the exhalation isn't there, but it's like I'm more interested in the experience I get as I breathe in, right? Just I have this interest in, wow, there's that lift, that brightness that comes, and I just keep tuning into that. That alone might, in fact, begin to pick you up a little bit. But there's a way that we can accentuate that, and that is by holding the breath. And so what you could try now is you breathe out, then the next time you breathe in, you hold the breath at the top with that full set of lungs and that sense of lift. And you just sit in that energy for a little bit, and then you breathe out. But then breathe in and again, hold the breath. Now, what you might find it useful to do, and probably a lot of breath work practices will suggest, is that you count. And so you might breathe in and out for 4 counts or 5 counts, but then you're holding the breath for that same number of counts, and you're doing it at the end of the inhalation. And so we call this a 3-part breathing, right? And we're adding the accent, we're adding the breath hold after the inhale with that sense of aliveness. So on the contrary, if you're feeling a little agitated, right? First, just acknowledging the exhale, really tuning into what in the body lets go as you breathe out, but then perhaps breathing out and holding the breath in that feeling. Then breathing in, breathing out, but again, holding the breath after the exhale. And this can accentuate the sort of relaxation, the letting go. Now, there's a way of combining these 2 forms, which were both, you might call it 3-part breathing, right? An inhale and exhale and a breath hold. But you can have a 4-part breathing, commonly known as box breathing. And that just means that I breathe in and I hold and I breathe out and I hold. And so this is more of a kind of a balancing, right? So maybe you begin with one of those first two practices that helps to pick you up, or maybe brings the energy level slightly down. But then if you just want to sort of maintain, the box breath might be a nice option for you. Now, actually, I feel like just adding one thing. Often we hear people say, if you're feeling anxious or stressed out, take a deep breath. And if you heard what I was just explaining about the in-breath and the activation, actually a big deep breath, especially like that can do the opposite of sort of chilling you out, which might be what you're looking for. If you notice, if something surprises you, what we often do is draw in a breath, like, right? I pull in my breath and then I kind of freeze in that place, and it's this very active energy. But if you just want to have a fuller breath in a kind of an immediate way, in fact, what you can do is breathe out and maybe even extend the out breath. So you really feel like you've emptied your lungs. And then you're not going to so much hold the breath, but you just pause and wait. And then the air is going to rush in and you'll have a nice big breath. You really feel that you're filling up with oxygen, but it's not going to be the same as that sense of take a deep breath, right? It's sort of just there's a kind of a forced energy there. Whereas breathing out and then pausing, allowing the air to flow in, that's a nice way to refresh. Okay. So these are some different simple options for I pause during my day, I pay attention to myself, I set the intention of kindness, and something I noticed was in relation to my breath. And one thing I could do right now is I could modulate my breath. And I gave you a few options. I have a number of videos on my channel. I just recorded a video. It's got a funny thumbnail of a kid picking their nose because it in fact involves touching the nose. And that's a little bit more of a involved process, but I invite you to check that video out. That's a wonderful procedure you can go through. It takes a few minutes, but will really deepen your breath in a wonderful way. Okay, and finally, as I mentioned, I'd like to invite you to explore your breath in terms of some specific relationships. And what I'm going to do is offer you a meditation. And I'm going to put that in a separate video from this one. But I'm just going to talk through right now the basic categories so that you can get a sense of it. And then maybe on another day, or if you have time now, you can listen to the meditation, because I think the meditation will give you the time to really taste each of these possibilities. First, though, I'd like to give you a sense of what are the different categories of relationship that we're going to consider, because we're going to use these again when we get to ground, space, sound, and light. So first of all, how is your breath in relation to your body? But then, how is your breath in relation to your mind and your thoughts? How is your breath in relation to your heart, your emotions, perhaps you would say? How is your breath in relation to the surrounding world? How is your breath in relation to particular other people? And how is your breath in relation to your soul? Now, you may or may not identify with the idea of soul. We're in a time period where, for many people, the divine and things that I can't see, or things that exist beyond the span of my lifetime, for a lot of people, that just doesn't resonate. If that's the case with you, I'm going to invite you to be curious. So your relationship to the divine, so-called, might just be that it doesn't exist, but that is a relationship. So all of these things might show up in your experience of the breath. Okay, so let's go through those categories. And what I'm going to suggest in each sense is that there's just a whole range, right? But in terms of this idea of well-being, we're going to think of it as moving towards well-being or perhaps away from well-being. And I'm going to give you some words, I'm going to give you some images, and they're nothing more than that. They're suggestions, but they might be a nice way to orient. You might find that other words or images work better for you, and definitely encourage you to play with that. So thinking of your relationship to your body, you might say a very nice place to be is having a sense of flow. And on the other hand, a not so nice place to be would be a sense of being stuck. So the breath might relate that your body feels like it's in flow, or it might relate that there's a feeling of stuckness. Now, for each of these relationships we're going to go through, we might think of that positive and negative, but also what's an intention I could have that would move me towards the feeling I want, and then maybe what's the thing that's happening when I'm not so present that's shifting me in the other direction. So you might think of the images of melting or dissolving as a way of moving towards flow. And you might think of the opposite kind of thing, like you're hardening or you're stiffening, and you might be doing that unconsciously. What about the relationship to the mind? An idea is that we'd like to experience stillness in the mind rather than having a chaotic or noisy mind. So how might we move towards stillness? Maybe just pausing, waiting. And again, when I say those words, it doesn't mean that I pause the breath so much as I'm in a state of pause. How do I breathe from there? But if I'm creating chaos for myself, maybe it's because I'm hurrying, I'm rushing, I'm grasping after things, right? So I can look for that sense, and the breath might be giving me a signal, giving me a hint. The heart. Maybe we'd like to have a sense of peace in the heart. On the other hand, we might find that in our heart, there's a sense of anxiety or some kind of fear. So what is the intention, or what is the feeling of being at peace? Well, if everything's peaceful, I can rest. I can just allow things to be as they are. There's nothing I have to do. But if I'm feeling anxious, I might be guarding. I might be defending. And again, it could be that I'm already guarding and defending, and that is leading towards the feeling of anxiety. What's the breath like if I'm resting and allowing? What's the breath like if I'm guarding and defending? Think about the surrounding world. The breathing is going in the body and out into the world, right? So we could consider this relationship as relationship, that the breath is an exchange, a giving and a receiving. Those might be intentions. But other times, the relationship to the world is kind of like everything is just background to my thoughts. And then when I need something, I go into the world to get it, right? Sort of, there's like a greediness that could be there. Or as opposed to giving and receiving, it's like I'm either winning or losing. How am I relating to other people? Now, this one, of course, is going to depend on which other person or people I'm around. But what's the quality of relationship I want to be having? And I'm not going to give you words here, but it's just worth noticing, first of all, that I might breathe differently around this person than that person, or someone who I'm generally comfortable around, and that's reflected in my breath. Today, my breath isn't so comfortable with that person. Well, what's going on there? So I'll be inviting you to notice your breath in relation to particular people, and how does the breath maybe reflect some quality of our relationship in this moment? The soul. We can be a lost soul at times. We can feel homeless in the world. We can feel abandoned. We might have a sense of lack. It's a feeling of being thirsty or hungry, starving even. That might be a quality that shows up in the breath. And yet, if my soul is being filled up, maybe that's reflected in a sense that the breath is nourishment, and I can drink in the breath. I can fill myself up with this nourishment. As I mentioned, I've recorded a meditation that will walk you through this in a way where you can really spend some more time with each of these particular ideas, which each of these forms of breathing, you might say. And so I will link that below this video, and you can go through that as well in your ongoing exploration of the breath. But once again, I just want to invite you into more intimacy, more curiosity about your breath, how you relate to your breath, or how we could say your breath reflects the relationships that you have in all of these different senses of the word relationship. And once you get clearer on that, once you have a little more refinement in that moment of practicing presence, by tuning into those elements that are always there, we'll have more capacity to observe what's going on with the breath. And should you wish to employ some kindness towards yourself, then you can also use the breath as a tool to do that. And I think you'll find that the more intimate you become with your breath, the more ways that you can also use your breath in service of kindness towards yourself and banish the unkindness of the inner critic. Okay, more next time. Thanks for watching.